60 years ago, the entire world waited to discover if World War III, indeed a nuclear world war, was about to commence, or if a peaceful resolution would be brokered between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America. It was a tense political and military game of chess that lasted 13 frightful days, where one wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, one military decision, or one rogue Soviet submarine commander could have changed the outcome of what we call today the Cuban Missile Crisis. History of this time frame between 15 and 28 October 1962 is replete with information and chronologies of all the intelligence gathered and each sequence of events that actually happened. But what about the history of that which did not happen? Lurking underwater, just outside the naval blockade, the commander of Soviet submarine B-59 had a decision to make. Would he surrender to the Americans or launch his special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, into one of the U.S. aircraft carriers as a first strike? Luckily for the world, and fortunately for him, protocol did not allow him to make that decision in a vacuum. And one dissenting voice, from an officer who really should not have been aboard at all, and who risked his very life in defiance of the captain's orders, achieved the impossible. To honor the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, to inform today's generation of how close we came to nuclear war, to remind us all why this nation shall never be a socialist nation, and to celebrate the courage of Captain Vasily Arkhipov. In coordination with the author and publisher of this excellent book, I am proud to bring you a special release preview of Stephen Maffeo's The Russian Who Saved the World, narrated by yours truly. This book is divided into two parts. Part 1 takes you through what might have happened if the nuclear torpedo was actually launched, and this is what you will hear today. Part 2 is what may have happened, told through the eyes and the persona of Captain Arkhipov. In Part 2, you are taken behind the scenes of the Soviet Navy, the decisions made, the treacherous transit to Cuba, and the various players who all helped maintain a level head in the face of mounting pressure to beat the Americans. This extremely thorough, well-researched, and expertly crafted story will be sure to inspire future listeners and readers of military history. To hear this book in its entirety, you can find it on Audible, Amazon, iTunes, and wherever you get your audiobooks. This is narrator Jason Markiewitz. Thank you for listening. Chapter 1. On board the Soviet Navy diesel-electric submarine B-59, Atlantic Ocean, 683 miles northeast of Cuba, approximately 26 degrees, 34 minutes north, 65 degrees, 47 minutes west, 1737 hours local, Saturday, October 27th, 1962, the 12th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Tie Capitan Arkhipov's hands behind his back.
Doubting he had heard correctly, the chief warrant officer of the watch stared blankly at Capitan Valentin Savitsky. The Michman had just come up from the control center into the boat's conning tower. A length of thin rope dangled from his hand.
"Are you deaf?"
shouted Savitsky, the commanding officer of the B-59.
"Do what I tell you, and do it now."
"Yes, Capitan."
Looking frightened and confused, the warrant officer came up to Arkhipov and grasped his left arm.
"Your pardon, Tovarish Capitan,"
he whispered. Arkhipov decided that there was no point in resisting the poor man and making a crazy situation even worse, so he shrugged and put his hands behind his back. He was grateful that the Michman tied the cord loosely, his sweat-slick fingers fumbling with the knot. The Michman was sweating because the conning tower's air temperature was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Similar temperatures, along with a humidity level approaching 100%, existed throughout the boat. Many of the crew lay in their bunks, on mess tables, or on the filthy and wet decks. Everyone was shiny with sweat. Everyone was gasping in the depleted air that was very short of life-sustaining oxygen and very full of dangerous amounts of carbon dioxide. Just then, the telephone talker caught Savitsky's eye.
Tovarish Kapitan, a new test says carbon dioxide is at 2.5%.
At 3%, most men would actually pass out. At 4%, even if there were some oxygen still present, the CO2 would suffocate all. Savitsky merely nodded. A few feet from him, appearing outwardly calm, Vasily Arkhipov was actually beside himself. Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the 69th Torpedo Submarine Brigade, was groping for ideas and searching for words to stop this madness. Captain Savitsky appeared ready to give the order to close the torpedo firing switch. If he did, then a massive blast of compressed air would ram the boat's special weapon out of Tube 2, with absolutely no way to call it back or stop it. The special weapon, the Specjalne Oruzhe, was one of B-59's 22 torpedoes. It was the one painted purple, the kind which Project 641 boats weren't supposed to carry, the one with the nuclear warhead. For one brief moment, hope flooded Arhipov's mind. While the torpedo indeed could be fired right now, in theory and in protocol, it still needed to be fed the bearing and range of the American aircraft carrier. Of course, the USS Randolph was the big target Savitsky was going to shoot, versus any of the small American destroyers. The Randolph was the obvious choice, as she was the flagship of the close-by U.S. Navy Anti-Submarine Task Force. This was the force that had been aggressively hounding and harassing the B-59 for the past 3 days. The Zampalit, Ivan Mostlenikov, B-59's hardline political officer, had already suggested this choice. But it would take some time to make those targeting inputs, time Arkhipov needed to puskat podotkos, derail this horrible scenario. In fact, next to the FDC-759 radar display in the control center, the B-59 had a computing machine, an electromechanical analog computer, which was essential to the effective firing of torpedoes. For 1962, it was state-of-the-art and incredibly useful. Once fed data from radar, sonar, or periscope readings, it would calculate a target's course, speed, and position. It would then send accurate gyroscope angles and other information to the torpedoes as they waited patiently in their tubes. American submariners called their version of this machine the Torpedo Data Computer. The Russians called theirs the Weapons Control Center. But, right now, B-59's was not even powered up. Unfortunately, Arhipov's hope for more time vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The Americans like to say, close only counts with horseshoes and hand grenades, but close also counts with nuclear weapons. Captain Arkhipov suddenly realized that Captain Savitsky needed neither precise analysis nor sophisticated solutions from the WCC. He only needed a couple of pencil calculations from the torpedo attack crew, the fire control party. All that was really necessary was to release the weapon in the approximate direction and distance of the carrier, and it would be good enough, unquestionably good enough. As if he were reading Arhipov's mind, Savitsky turned and shouted down the ladder into the CC.
Fire control! You have been plotting the enemy?
B-59's officers had taken note of the bearings and ranges of the American ships when the boat was last forced to dive. The executive officer and torpedo officer were up in the conning tower, but the rest of the fire control party, the navigator, a sonar technician, and the idle WCC operator, were packed around the navigator's plotting table in the CC, poring over the charts with dividers, parallel rulers, and colored pencils. At this moment, the OSNOS radio interception officer, Senior Lieutenant Vadim Arlov, was also in that group.
Da, tovarish Kapitan,
replied Captain Lieutenant Sezhir Sutulin, the senior navigator. He called up the conning tower ladder, which was easy to do as the ladder's foot was immediately adjacent to the plotting table.
Do you have an estimate for the goddamned carrier?
Da, Kapitan. Based on her last observed position, and assuming she has not significantly changed course or speed, da.
That was a fair assumption. To facilitate her aircraft operations, the carrier would likely be cruising steadily and relatively slowly. In contrast, it was not clear where all of her destroyers were, as they were dancing around everywhere on the sea looking for Savitsky's boat, and for any other Soviet submarines. Of course, the whereabouts of 5 of the destroyers were very clear to the Russians. They were directly above the B-59.
"And, sir,"
added the sonar technician,
"we have periodically been hearing the carrier on our Phoenix passive sonar system. We know where she is." "Excellent. Distance?"
"Sir, estimate 3.7 kilometers."
"Bearing!"
Savitsky actually snarled.
"Sir, estimate target bearing 292 degrees."
This response was from Lieutenant Arloff. While Sutulin was carefully plotting the movements of the B-59, Arloff was employing the skills of his original naval career specialization as a navigator and was tracking the American ship. The kill radius of the special weapon was just under 12 kilometers. Depending upon what Savitsky was going to do in the next few minutes, the USS Randolph, her destroyers, her support ships, many of her aircraft, and very likely the B-59 were all going to die together. Savitsky clapped his bloody hands together, apparently not feeling any pain from his lacerated knuckles.
"Officer on deck, make your course 292, speed 4 knots."
"Yes, Capitan." This would point the B-59 and her forward torpedo tubes at what the Russians estimated was the Randolph's current position. The navigator handed a scrap of paper to the telephone talker, who then passed the distance and gyro data to the forward torpedo room. There, a torpedo man would manually enter that data into Tube 2's guidance system, which was part of a control panel mounted in between Tubes 5 and 6. The Officer Torpede, Senior Lieutenant Kirillyu Sluchevsky, then said, "Capitan, shall we make a final shooting observation?"
"No, конечно нет."
"Hell no."
"And we shall not come up to periscope depth. We shall not raise the scope. For the same reason, we shall not employ the active sonar. We would betray our exact position. The destroyers would pounce on us before we could shoot. We have enough information, Sluchevsky. They cannot escape. The special weapon will destroy them all."
"Oh, Gospoda," Arhipov said to himself. "Oh, God of my sainted babushka." If Savitsky now merely called out, "Shoot," it was going to happen. Was he going to forget that he needed Arhipov's agreement? Or was he simply going to ignore the rules of engagement? If he gave the order, would the torpedo officer refuse, or at least hesitate? Or would Lieutenant Sluchevsky obediently reach over to the instrument panel just at his eye level? Would his fingers close around the torpedo firing circuit switch? Would he turn it?
"Tovarish Capitan,"
said Arhipov, loudly, desperately. He took a step toward Savitsky, but Savitsky, raising his arms while simultaneously stepping toward the chief of staff, slammed his bloody fists into Arhipov's chest. Thrown off balance with his hands tied behind him, Arhipov slipped on the wet deck and fell down, hitting his head but able to keep his nose from smacking into the periscope housing. But as Savitsky moved, so did the chief engineer. Bogdan Pugachev leapt forward and threw his arms around his captain from behind.
"Capitan,"
Pugachev said quietly in the stunned silence of the conning tower.
"Valentin Grigorievich."
Savitsky tried to shake him off.
"Let me go."
But Pugachev held on firmly.
"God damn it!"
Savitsky screamed, continuing to shake.
"Why is Captain Arhipov still in my goddamned conning tower? Get him below and out of my sight."
Pugachev continued to hold his commanding officer in a bear hug. Arhipov shakily got back to his feet, helped by the Starpom, the executive officer, Zakhar Chernyshov. Despite Savitsky's order, no one seemed interested in moving Arhipov down the ladder and out of the conning tower, so he started speaking again. Arhipov was desperate to get Savitsky thinking rather than fighting.
"Tovarish Capitan, the rules of engagement for this mission are clear."
Saying nothing, Savitsky stared past Arhipov's shoulder. Thus encouraged, Arhipov went on.
"We are authorized to fire the special weapon if we are attacked, either on the surface or under the water, and if, as a result of such attack, our pressure hull is damaged. We may also fire it if we are so directed by signal from Moskva. But as of right now, Valentin, None of these conditions have been met." With his arms tied behind him, Arhipov unsuccessfully tried to shake off the sweat pouring into his eyes. "Despite the infernal harassment the Amerikanza have given us these last 3 days, they have dropped no fully armed depth charges upon us. We have to conclude that at this time there is no state of war. Moreover," Arhipov continued, "we can fire the special weapon, and let us be clear about this, Captain Gentleman." He glanced around the compartment, finding all eyes on him once again. Most important, he hoped that the torpedo officer, standing so close to that damned firing switch, was paying attention. "Let us be clear. It is a torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead. Once again, we can fire it only if you and the Zempolit and I all agree. All 3 of us. This is no mere bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo to which we can pay attention or not. These rules are inviolate. We cannot release a nuclear weapon outside of this protocol. As we all know, those rules came clearly and directly from Admiral Flata Sergei Gorshkov and were relayed to us by Counter-Admiral Leonid Rybalka. If we violate these rules, we would be subject to court-martial. We would doubtless spend the rest of our lives in a Siberian gulag. Of course, that would only happen if we lived to get home, and if there remained a home to go to, neither of which would be likely." Arhipov paused for a moment as he tried to catch his breath. For him and everyone else, it felt as if all the oxygen molecules had been boiled out of the air. "Again, Valentin, any command on your part to fire the special weapon absolutely requires Tovarish Moslenikov's assent and my assent." Arhipov paused for a few seconds to give his words emphasis. He was speaking to the Zampalit and the Starpom, as well as the Capitan, hoping that all 3 were turning the issues over in their minds. Arhipov hoped that Glavny Engineer Pugachev was also carefully listening. "You have the Zampalit's assent, but I say again, Tovarish Capitan, as clearly as I can, I do not give mine." Savitsky stared at Arhipov so intently that Arhipov feared his eyes might pop out of their sockets. Then Savitsky drew a deep breath and violently shook his head, scowling. He had been relatively still for the last few minutes, but now resumed struggling against Pugachev's hug. They both slipped on the wet deck and fell down. Breaking from Pugachev's grasp, Savitsky scooted to the side and pulled himself up using the periscope. Pugachev grabbed him by the leg, but Savitsky savagely shook him off and then kicked him in the head. The chief engineer fell to the wet deck. Savitsky took a deep breath of the foul air and then screamed at Lieutenant Sluchevsky, "Strilyat! God damn you, shoot! Shoot the special weapon!" Officer Torpedi Sluchevsky, looking shocked with his eyes popping, hesitated. Captain Arhipov, looking shocked with his jaws clenched, launched himself at Sluchevsky. "No! Stop! No!" Arhipov shouted. He desperately tried to tackle Sluchevsky and throw him to the deck, or failing, that he hoped to knock his arm away from the instrument panel. But even in the small conning tower, Arhipov was just too far away. He did not get there in time. As Arhipov rushed towards him, Sluchevsky shook off his initial hesitation, reached out, grasped the firing switch, and turned it. B-59 lurched as a compressed air charge rammed 4,000 pounds of nuclear-armed torpedo out of her. Already very much off balance, Arhipov again fell heavily to the deck. In both the conning tower and the control center there was a moment of stunned silence. Savitsky and Arhipov stared at Sluchevsky and then at each other. The torpedo officer stuck his fingers in his mouth as if to cool them from the touch of the firing switch. Chernyshov was the first to recover. "Pogruzhanya, dive, now! Emergency dive, take her down, 350 meters, hard right rudder." He looked up and shuddered as if he could feel dozens of fully armed depth charges rolling off the racks of the circling destroyers above, dropping down towards the B-59. Then Chernyshov shuddered again,
anticipating the massive shockwave of a 10-kiloton nuclear explosion reaching down for him through the depths. Chapter 2. Cabinet Room, West Wing, the White House, Washington, D.C. 1902 hours local, Saturday, October 27, 1962, the 12th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The 13 members and a few other advisors of the ex-COM were hard at work. The ex-COM was the Executive Committee of the United States National Security Council, recently formed to address the Cuban crisis. Most of the men were seated around the huge conference table in tense but quiet discussion. Right now, these men included the President himself, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, the Attorney General, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several others. Earlier today, a little more than 7 hours earlier, an American U-2F reconnaissance aircraft had been destroyed almost 72,000 feet above Banas, Cuba. It was shot down by a Soviet S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, U.S. Air Force, was killed. As a result, the already stressful standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States had now become absolutely terrifying. The American defense establishment had 5 levels of defense readiness conditions, with DEFCON 5 being normal peacetime, and DEFCON 1 being set for the most dangerous, severe situations, including imminent or ongoing nuclear war. The current condition, elevated a few days earlier, was DEFCON 3. However, General Thomas Power, the commander of the U.S. Air Force's formidable Strategic Air Command, had secretly been authorized to set his force at DEFCON 2. He had, on alert, approximately 900 strategic bombers, 400 tanker aircraft, and 130 strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles. As of 1100 hours today, he had been further authorized to bring all of his remaining forces, including the Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard, to full readiness, such that they would be cocked, locked, and ready to strike. The Strategic Air Command controlled 2,900 nuclear weapons. 5 days earlier, 7 U.S. Navy nuclear-powered missile submarines had moved to staging points at sea. They carried 112 strategic ballistic missiles, armed with nuclear warheads. Right now, looking around the conference table, President John F. Kennedy called for everyone's attention and began speaking to the group. The Soviets fired the first shot today, destroying the U-2. He paused to rub his eyes. We're now in an entirely new ballgame. He looked around the room. If worse comes to worse, God forbid, and I had to order the use of nuclear weapons. He paused for a moment. I know that the red button on my desk phone will connect me with the White House Army Signal Agency switchboard. I know that they will connect me instantly to the Joint War Room at the Pentagon. But please remind me, if I called the Joint War Room, to whom would I be speaking? And what would I say to them to launch an immediate nuclear strike? Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara exchanged a look with the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Maxwell Taylor, U.S. Army. McNamara said, Mr. President, those are good questions, which, of course, we can easily answer. But right now, during a situation like this one, with all of us here in your presence, you need to do nothing more than make your decision and give the word. We will instantly do what needs to be done. Kennedy nodded, and then stared silently at the table for a moment. This looks like hell. It looks real mean, doesn't it? And, on the other hand, it's just a question of where the Soviets will go do something next. If they get this mean on this one in our part of the world, what will they do on the next confrontation somewhere else? He thought for a moment, and then went on. No choice. I don't think there was a choice. We had to do something. I didn't want airstrikes against Cuba, or, for God's sake, an invasion. Declaring the quarantine line seems a good choice, though it's risky in its own right. Well, there wasn't any choice, replied Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General, the President's brother, and the President's closest advisor. You had to do something serious. You had to take action. If not, you would have been, Well, you would have been impeached. That's what I think, said the president. I would have been impeached. I think the Congress would have moved to impeach. And even so, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't move to impeach me after the coming November elections. They'll impeach on the grounds, I said we'd take strong action, and they don't think I've done enough. Jack, I don't think that will happen, said the Attorney General. If you'd done nothing, or taken some other step that wasn't necessary, then you'd be in trouble. Okay, yeah, said the president. But now, the fact is you couldn't have done any less, and I think you shouldn't have done any more. The quarantine was a good solution, and it seems to be working, despite this U-2 incident. As you said, this may well change the game. President Kennedy nodded his head and looked around the room and focused upon the wall clock. Gentlemen, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to keep you this long. It's been a hell of a long day after a long and stressful week. We've been hard at this session for 3.5 hours. We need to finish the message to Khrushchev. But let's break right now. Everybody get a bite to eat and then come back and we'll see what we can do. So, can we get back together at 9 and... The door slammed open, and a Central Intelligence Agency watch officer flew into the room. He was out of breath, having sprinted from the recently created White House Situation Room and Communication Center, located in the basement of the West Wing. Sir, Mr. President, flash message from Commander ASW Task Group 83.2, USS Randolph, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, which we'd previously designated as Contact C-19, just fired a torpedo apparently at the Randolph. President Kennedy and the other ex-com members literally jumped to their feet. God in heaven. Mr. President, exclaimed Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, you must order that submarine destroyed, right now. LeMay was not a full member of the ex-com, but he was present as a senior advisor. Hold on, damn it, replied Kennedy. Where is this happening exactly? Sir, the Randolph is about 80 miles northeast of the quarantine line. Her destroyers and aircraft have been aggressively pursuing Contact C-19 for over 2 days. Okay. Now, we do know for certain it's a Soviet diesel-electric submarine, asked Kennedy. Yes, Mr. President. According to Wednesday's briefing, this class of submarine does not carry nuclear weapons. Tell me again, is that right? That is correct, Mr. President. Foxtrots are not missile-firing boats, and they do not carry nuclear weapons of any kind. They do carry conventional torpedoes, or, on occasion, naval mines. Sir, you must, began General LeMay. How far away was this goddamn submarine? Interrupted Kennedy. I mean, how long will it take for this torpedo to reach the Randolph? Sir, we don't know precisely, but a fair estimate from last known positions would be about 3 minutes. Kennedy's eyebrows shot up. Well, hell, those minutes must be up by now. You know, I used to shoot torpedoes. From what I remember, 3 minutes is a damn long run. Damn long. And the Randolph can take evasive action. Surely the damn thing will miss. As if on cue, another CIA watch officer charged into the room through the same still-open door. Mr. President, he shouted, flash messages from the USS Essex and also ASW Task Group 81.5 at Bermuda. A nuclear explosion has been detected at the location of the carrier Randolph. The room was silent with shock and surprise. Every member of the ex-com was completely stunned. No one expected this news. No one. The second CIA officer, catching his breath, continued. Sir, the first assessment of the detonation is 10 kilotons, subsurface. Not huge. Appears similar to the Hiroshima bomb. That still needs to be verified, but the Randolph cannot be raised on any comm channel, nor can any of her destroyers. Good God, exclaimed Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State. Can a naval torpedo carry a nuclear warhead of that force? No one spoke, but McNamara and Taylor both nodded their heads. President Kennedy had been pacing in a small circle to the side of the conference table.
Just what the hell is going on? He exploded. What are those Soviet bastards doing? They've put nuclear torpedoes on submarines which aren't supposed to have them. He paused for a moment. It's been said that the Russians are great chess players, mumbled Ken O'Donnell, the president's special assistant and appointments secretary. When they wish to execute a plot, they execute it brilliantly. The game is played minutely. The gambits of the enemy are provided for. They are foreseen and countered. Where did you get that, Kenny? Asked the president. Ian Fleming, O'Donnell replied, looking sheepish. Well, I'm not seeing any brilliance or great planning here, said President Kennedy, looking annoyed. They shoot down aircraft of the U.S. Air Force. Then, out of the blue, they shoot nuclear torpedoes at the U.S. Navy. All this practically in our backyard. He slammed his fist into his padded leather chair. And they do all these things on a high-stress day, a day that's already so tense we don't know whether to shit or go blind. He paced a few steps and then paced back. No, sir. No. Khrushchev is a goddamn mystery. Why has he put nuclear missiles in Cuba in the first place? What's the advantage in that? And why does he attack us with a nuclear weapon while we're in the middle of an intense standoff? While we're trying like hell to negotiate? What does he expect us to do? What gambits does he think we'll come up with in the face of this horrendous action? It makes no sense. I know Khrushchev's a tough and ruthless son of a bitch, but until now I never thought he was totally nuts.
This shows that the threat never has been Castro or Cuba. This underscores that the threat is the Soviet Union. And so far, said Theodore Sorensen, special counsel to the president, in this mess, the Soviets and Khrushchev's motions have been inscrutable.
Well, no shit, Ted, said Robert Kennedy.
So what should we do? What can we do? Asked Vice President Lyndon Johnson from across the conference table. Do? Bellowed General LeMay, smacking his hands together. Do? We respond immediately. We attack. We have to with all we've got. Obviously, the Ruskies have decided to go for the whole thing, so it doesn't matter whether they think we're playing world-class chess or whether they've just gone nuts. They've started a goddamn nuclear war, and we've got to get off our asses and get with it right now. Former Secretary of State Dean Acheson cleared his throat. Mr. President, I'm afraid that I have to agree with General LeMay. None of us wanted this, but the die has just been cast. A war has been thrust upon us. We must quickly respond, and we must respond with full measures. What if it's an accident? Asked the president. Sir, we don't know, and it doesn't matter, said LeMay impatiently. He gave Kennedy a sour look. We have to assume it is not. We must assume it's the first nuke they've deployed, which will be rapidly followed by all they have. So we need to retaliate with everything we have. LeMay took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled it. They've started it. We need to stop it. The quicker we stop it, the more lives we'll save. I'm sorry, Mr. President, he said in a quieter voice. But there's just no two ways about it. You are in a pretty bad fix right now. What? What did you say? Replied Kennedy. You're in a pretty bad fix. Well, General, you're in there with me, personally. After a long pause while Kennedy and LeMay glared at each other, Kennedy turned to the Secretary of Defense. Bob, what do you advise? Mr. President, replied McNamara slowly, sometimes in order to do good, you may have to engage in evil. Kennedy gave him a long, hard look in turn. Mac? Mr. President, said McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, I'm horrified at what you're asking, but I don't see that you, have any choice. You said as much in your TV speech to the world on Monday. You said any use of a nuclear weapon against any nation in the Western Hemisphere will instantly cause a full retaliatory response from us upon the Soviet Union. We all agreed. We helped you craft that position.
He paused for a moment. Of course, at that point we envisioned a strike coming from Cuba itself, but this is actually worse. It's clearly a Soviet Navy warship directly striking warships of the United States Navy. And I, too, am afraid it's likely the beginning of a full Soviet nuclear attack, as crazy as that would seem.
Well, goddammit, that's what I'm saying, exploded LeMay. We have to assume it's the beginning of a full-blown Soviet nuclear attack against us. Maybe the jackass CO of that rust bucket submarine jumped the gun and fired prematurely. Or maybe he was actually supposed to start things off. Or maybe he's just gone batshit crazy. It does not matter. We've got to attack, and right now.
General,
what, pardon me, are you waiting for, Mr. President? More evidence? You want another gray-suited CIA clown to burst in the room and tell you another Foxtrot has just vaporized the Essex? Or maybe that the other couple of Rusky subs down there, which right now the Navy's apparently misplaced, have nuked the Enterprise and the Independence. Or the goddamn Cubans have put a nuke missile or artillery shell into Naval Station Guantanamo. Sir, every minute we wait works against us.
He spit out some tobacco from the unlit cigar he was furiously chewing.
Like I said before, we need to get on this fast and end it fast. Are you going to wait around until more spooks rush in, this time announcing that they've detected the launch of the full Soviet ICBM and bomber force? And they're all coming our way at the speed of heat. Come on! Come on! We need to respond now! He thought for a moment. And, by the way, we've also got to cream the Cubans as well as the Soviets. You know Castro won't miss the chance to throw some of his new Rusky missiles at us. We need to get them on the ground before they get in the air. The room was silent for a moment, as everyone digested the situation. Finally, General Taylor said, I think General LeMay is correct, Mr. President. I just don't know how else we can interpret this event. I think we have to assume the worst, and time is not in our favor.
Secretary Rusk said, I've long believed that the first side to use nuclear weapons would carry a very grave responsibility and endure heavy consequences before the rest of the world.
For Christ's sake, Mr. Secretary, shouted LeMay. They, the Ruskies, already have struck first. So, fine, they are gravely responsible. Indeed, they are very bad people. Somebody get a pencil. Let's write that down and issue a memorandum. He spit more tobacco. But now we must stand up to our responsibilities. Now we must throw everything we have at them before everything they have hits us. And, with any luck, maybe we can destroy a lot of their weapons before launch, or at least in the air before they get to us. I can see you politicians are hung up on the morality of all this, but I think it's more immoral to use too little than it is to use too much. If you dilly-dally with indecision and go light rather than heavy, you'll end up killing off more of humanity in the long run, because you'll be merely delaying and protracting the struggle.
Dean Acheson nodded his head. Yes, we can't wait until we detect their missiles launch or see their bombers up on radar. It'll be too late at that point. In order to maximize our chances of survival, we must strike immediately. He looked at the Air Force Chief of Staff, who was halfway finished chewing through his cigar. Acheson went on. I'm heartsick to say it, but I think the Russians have brought Secretary Rusk's heavy consequences upon themselves. Sorrowfully, they have brought them upon the world. General Taylor said, If we move now and decisively, we might be able to save the situation. He threw up his hands. Well, of course, by that I don't mean save, I mean minimize our casualties. The president furiously rubbed his eyes. He had slept very little this week, and not much at all in the past 2 days. Gentlemen, under the present circumstances, does anyone here believe that there is any other reasonable course open to us? He slowly looked around the room. Most of the ex-com members met his gaze with distraught expressions. A few stared at the floor. Some had buried their faces in their hands, but no one spoke. Kennedy looked from side to side. He was trapped, and he felt trapped. My God, How could this have happened? The president sat down in an armchair and massaged his right temple. Am I to be the greatest mass murderer in history? It isn't murder, said Bundy. It's war. It isn't murder if you're fighting for your country's existence, if you're fighting to save your citizens' lives. Yes, interjected LeMay. Mr. President, of course, as you know, this isn't a new concept, said McNamara. We've been worried about such a scenario for 15 years. We've wargamed such things 100 times. In the fear of nuclear war, we've built a huge defense and strike capability, hopefully to deter, but also to act if necessary.
He's right, sir, said Ted Sorensen. We've gamed it over and over. We're not kids in a schoolyard fistfight, which all of a sudden just broke out to everyone's surprise. We've thought these scenarios through and studied angles and options. If they do A, we do C. If they do M, we respond with P. If we do X, then they'll do Y. He paused, started to speak again, but then looked away with his thought unfinished. Seconds passed. Finally, Bobby Kennedy cleared his throat and addressed his brother. Jack, he said slowly and sadly. Jack, there's nothing else to do. Ever since the U-2 shoot down earlier today, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that the noose was really tightening. On we Americans, on mankind, and that the bridge to escape was crumbling. At this point, I think any such bridge is gone. He paused for a moment, thinking. There's nothing else to do. As a sophisticated student of history, John F. Kennedy knew he was cornered by an outrageous and unlikely twist of fate. He now had to make the most incredible decision that any leader could ever hope not to face. He stared at the famous portrait of George Washington, which hung over the mantel on the north wall of the room. He was quiet for a long, long moment. Then he quietly began to speak. Mr. Secretary of Defense, Mr. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is an order. I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States of America, do hereby direct you to set Defense Condition 1. I further order you to immediately implement the Single Integrated Operational Plan. Commence a full-scale nuclear attack upon the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the nations of the Warsaw Pact, and the Republic of Cuba. He was silent for almost a minute. God help us. God help me. As he spoke, the president turned very pale. He then covered his mouth with his one hand, made a fist with his other hand, and stared bleakly at his brother. Chapter 3. After 36 hours and the detonation of the final nuclear weapon, the war was over. As it began, American strategic forces were many times larger and much more reliable than their Soviet counterparts. The United States possessed over 3,500 nuclear weapons of different sizes, including small artillery shells owned by U.S. Army units in Europe and small depth charges owned by the U.S. Navy. All of these weapons totaled a combined yield of some 6,300 megatons. At the time of the attack, the Air Force's Strategic Air Command was organizing and readying everything it had: regular, reserve, and National Guard, which was close to 1,480 bombers, 1,000 refueling tanker aircraft, and 180 ICBMs, all together capable of delivering 2,900 nuclear weapons. In addition, the U.S. Navy's Strategic Submarine Force brought to bear over 100 nuclear ICBMs. Despite the USSR's boastful propaganda, there was a much smaller Soviet arsenal facing the American force. 40 ICBMs carried a combined yield of some 200 megatons. Only 140 bombers were available. A handful of submarines carried only 80 missiles, with a combined yield of less than 100 megatons. In fact, it was believed that Premier Khrushchev and his military advisors had recently estimated that U.S. strategic nuclear forces outnumbered the USSR's by a factor approaching 17 to 1. Thus, nearly 2,000 megatons of American nuclear fire struck the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Cuba. Those nations were effectively destroyed. They essentially ceased to exist.
Relatively few Soviet nuclear weapons were able to reach the United States, perhaps only around 30, but the impact was still terrible. Millions of people died. Yet, the country and the civilization were not destroyed. Many states and cities were not hit. Many parts of the government, the military, and the infrastructure survived. So the exchange went substantially in favor of the United States, if it really could be considered in those terms. But large swaths of Western Europe and North America lay in ruins. The expected radiation clouds and overall worldwide fallout were terrible, but thankfully were significantly less than earlier war games had suggested they might be. This was due to both sides predominantly using high-altitude airbursts rather than ground bursts. This minimized the amount of radioactive dirt and other debris being thrown into the atmosphere. However, it is estimated that over 500 million people died from the explosions, radiation poisoning, and eventual starvation. Millions more were displaced and became homeless refugees. It was, perhaps, not a Holocaust beyond all imagination. It was not literally the end of the world. But, depending upon your perspective, it certainly appeared that way. This has been a special premiere presentation of Stephen Maffeo's The Russian Who Saved the World. What you just heard was how it might have happened if the nuclear torpedo was launched, destroying the USS Randolph and every other vessel in proximity, and the nuclear exchange that would have followed. Thankfully, this is historical fiction, and that torpedo firing switch was never activated, and Captain Savitsky did stand down. To hear the rest of this audiobook, please visit audible.com to get your copy today. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel and keep up to date on future events. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. On behalf of Focsle LLP and author Stephen Maffeo, this is Jason Markiewicz. Thank you for listening.